new iPhones are finally here, and this is the compact, yet feature-packed iPhone 14 Pro. It's not a huge overhaul compared to the previous model, but there are still some meaningful changes that are worth digging into. I'm Will for GSM Arena, and this is our iPhone 14 Pro review. The iPhone 14 Pro brings the full set of flagship features that you'd find on the iPhone 14 Pro Max. It's just more compact, so it has a smaller screen and battery. As we've seen all throughout the smartphone industry this year, the new iPhones don't exactly break the mold, but even so, right off the bat you will notice a couple of differences from last year. First and foremost, Apple has replaced the notch cutout for the selfie cam and 3D face recognition, with a pill-shaped one called the Dynamic Island. And the new model brings a new 48 megapixel main cam, and you'll notice that the 3 camera bumps are wider in diameter now to keep things symmetrical. They also stick out more from the back panel. Besides that, the design hasn't really changed at all. The flat back is protected by ceramic shield glass, and there's the glossy, flat steel frame. The size and weight are basically the same as before too. The matte black color is tweaked now to be a little darker though, and there's also a new purple color available. Of course, the new iPhones are also IP68 rated against dust and water up to 6 meters in depth, just like last year. The display of the iPhone 14 Pro is a 6.1-inch Super Retina XDR OLED. It's sharp at 460 ppi, and there's ceramic shield protection and a 120Hz refresh rate. It might seem at first glance like nothing has changed here, but there are a few upgrades since last year. First, there's the brightness. With the manual slider, we got a maximum of 840 nits, about the same as the iPhone 13 Pro. But with auto brightness mode on, it can boost to an incredible 1800 nits, way more than any competitor. The iPhone 14 Pro and Pro Max are also the first iPhones to feature an always-on display. It basically keeps the lock screen on, with a dim brightness level that adapts to the ambient light. The 120Hz refresh rate is something relatively new to the iPhones. It smooths out your swiping and scrolling, and can dial down to save energy, all the way to 10Hz while the screen is on, and now 1Hz for the always-on display. But probably the most hyped new feature on this display is the Dynamic Island. Apple wants to make selfie cutouts cool again. In its inactive form, there's just a blackened cutout that covers the selfie cam and Face ID sensors. But when it activates, the cutout gets extended through the UI to include extra black space on the left and right sides. This space is used to display things from a compatible app, like music or call info. Or it can show a system alert, like charging, or if you switch the phone to silent. It generally works for one thing at a time, but in some cases a second app is supported, like with the timer app. This will split up the Dynamic Island into an eye shape. Tapping and holding on these icons will open them into a larger balloon window, or a simple tap will directly open up the respective app. Apple also plans to include more functionality for the Dynamic Island, like real-time notifications for sports and events. One slight downside of the new cutout is that it sits a bit lower than the previous notch, and that means it does take up a bit more usable screen space. But overall, this display is just great. Content is sharp, vibrant, and contrasty, and the color accuracy is praiseworthy too. And there's support for HDR10 and Dolby Vision as well. For audio, the iPhone 14 Pro has a pair of stereo speakers, with the earpiece doubling as the second speaker. They earned a score of good in our loudness test, and the sound quality is excellent, with top-notch vocals, rich highs, and good bass. There are plenty of storage options for the iPhone 14 Pro, 128, 256, or 512 gigs, or even a whole terabyte. And the interface of the new iPhone generation is the new iOS 16. It's not a groundbreaking update, but there are a few tweaks here and there. The lock screen / always-on display houses your notifications, and you can customize it with wallpapers and even add widgets. You can make several different layouts too, and switch between them on the fly. Specific lock screen layouts can also be linked to different focus modes. Those are the customizable profiles that filter your notifications and calls. The focus modes can even connect to your mail and messaging apps to filter your messages and emails right from the source. And there's an emergency SOS feature which provides several ways to request aid if you're in trouble. In some regions, you can even use the iPhone 14 Pro to contact emergency services through satellite, like when there's no cell coverage. iOS 16 also brings improvements to various apps like Messages, Home, FaceTime, Photos, and the Wallet app, among many others. At the very heart of the iPhone 14 Pro is a new chipset, the Apple A16 Bionic. It contains 1 billion more transistors than the previous A15, and it boasts more power-efficient CPU cores, as well as more memory bandwidth for the GPU. There are also upgrades in the Neural Engine and the ISP for computational photography, and there's a new display engine behind the Dynamic Island and always-on features. In benchmarks, there's not much difference this time around when it comes to graphics performance, but it's still right there at the top of the charts. And when it comes to the CPU, the iPhone 14 Pro edges out the previous model, posting some of the best scores on the market right now. On top of that, the thermal management seems to have improved as well. We measured excellent stability in our stress tests. The iPhone 14 Pro has a slightly larger battery capacity than last year at 3200 mAh. Battery life is much the same though, with an overall endurance rating of 86 hours in our proprietary tests. As usual, you don't get a charger in the box, but we tested the charging speed using Apple's official 20-watt adapter. With it, we were able to charge the iPhone 14 Pro from 0 to 60% in half an hour. Finally, let's go over the cameras. As I mentioned before, the big excitement is the change from a 12-megapixel sensor in the main cam to a 48-megapixel one with a quad-Bayer filter. It also features second-gen sensor shift stabilization and full-focus pixels. Besides the main cam, there's the 12-megapixel ultra-wide cam which has a new sensor and lens, and like last year, it has autofocus. The 12-megapixel 3x telephoto hasn't changed this time around, and finally there's a LiDAR scanner for portraits and focus. Since the main cam has a quad-Bayer filter, it bins pixels 4:1 to produce 12-megapixel photos by default. In daylight, actually, these are hardly different from what we've seen from the iPhones in the past couple of years. They have a great amount of detail, superb contrast, and no noise. The colors are accurate as always. And we unfortunately also get the iPhone's typical over-sharpened foliage rendition. You have the option to shoot in the full 48 megapixels in RAW format, and unlike the full resolution modes of other phones with quad-Bayer cameras, this one takes some excellent shots. The photos offer an impressive amount of detail and outstanding sharpness. They're free of noise and have likable dynamic range, superb contrast, and accurate colors. And if you happen to downsize one of these photos back to 12 megapixels, the results are class-leading for this resolution. And compared to the default 12 megapixel shots, these have an incredibly natural look. Too bad you had to jump through hoops to get there. The iPhone 14 Pro manages to provide 2x lossless zoom by cropping from the center of the 48 megapixel image, and the 2x zoom photos are outstanding. The detail is plenty, the sharpening is just right, and the photos are as contrasty and colorful as the standard ones. When taking portraits, the phone defaults to the 2x zoom, and the results are great. The subjects have outstanding detail and sharpness, the separation is accurate, and the blurred backgrounds look nice. You also have the option to take portraits with the main cam at 1x zoom, or with the telephoto cam at 3x, for a different perspective. The telephoto's regular 3x zoom photos are excellent. They're detailed and sharp with a likable rendition. The colors are accurate, the contrast is high, and the dynamic range is wide enough. The noise is low too, if the lighting is ideal. Now onto the ultra-wide. Its 12 megapixel photos are some of the best we've seen from this sort of camera. They are detailed and have a really wide field of view, yet at the same time, proficient distortion correction and sharp corners. The noise is low, and the colors, contrast, and dynamic range are great, matching the other two cameras. The ultra-wide has dual pixel autofocus, so you can use it to take macro close-up shots from a focus distance as close as 4 centimeters. The results are quite impressive, with sharp and detailed subjects, low noise, great contrast, and splendid colors. In low light conditions, Apple's night mode will kick in automatically. The photos from the main cam are great. The exposure is excellent, even a bit brighter than reality. There's plenty of resolved detail and the noise is kept quite low. The color saturation deserves praise too. Dynamic range is good with well-developed highlights and brightened up shadows. You can toggle the night mode off and the resulting photos are darker with more noise in dark areas. There's also lower detail and sharpness, and the colors aren't as saturated either. The dynamic range is still good though. When the night mode is working, 3x zoomed shots will come from the telephoto cam. They have an impressive level of detail, low noise, and natural sharpness. The contrast and colors are great too. If the night mode is toggled off or doesn't kick in, at this level of zoom you'll get a crop from the main camera. Still, the quality is good here. The exposure is a bit darker with lower contrast and dynamic range, but there's still enough detail and saturated colors. The ultra-wide camera takes good low-light photos with the help of night mode. The resolve detail is just okay, but the images have good exposure and brightness, saturated colors, nice contrast, and wider than expected dynamic range. Without night mode, the photos are darker and noisier, and a bit more desaturated, but they're still usable. On to selfies, and this year Apple has brought OIS and autofocus to the front-facing camera. The 12 megapixel selfies are great. The autofocus works well, and there's plenty of resolve detail, low noise, accurate colors, and wide dynamic range. Facial features are enhanced a bit too much though, which may come through as unflattering. The iPhone 14 Pro can record 4K video in up to 60 FPS with the selfie cam and all 3 rear cameras. And all modes feature expanded dynamic range through Smart HDR. The 4K videos from the selfie camera are superb. The subject is sharp and well exposed, and the colors and contrast are great. The dynamic is quite natural looking, and you get both a naturally defocused background and the handy autofocus. The rear main camera shoots magnificent 4K videos with a ton of resolve detail and natural rendition without any over-sharpening. There's no noise, the colors are lively, and both the contrast and dynamic range are great. The telephoto camera is a close match to the primary one, but zoomed. The rendition is natural and there's enough detail, and all the other properties are excellent. The 4K footage from the ultra-wide camera is class-leading, with exceptional detail levels, and outstanding rendition and color presentation. There's good contrast and low noise, and no visible distortion around the corners. The electronic stabilization is always on, and it's just as good as ever. There is a new mode called Enhanced Stabilization, which crops more and is supposedly smoother, but we didn't see much difference there. And there's another called Action Mode. It's meant to be used with the ultra-wide, and it crops heavily from the 4K 60 FPS footage to produce a super smooth and incredibly stabilized 2K video. The Action Mode also can work with the main cam, but after that crop, the resulting field of view is quite narrow. Low-light 4K video from the main cam is great, with plenty of resolve detail, natural sharpness, good exposure, and low noise. The color saturation is superb, and the dynamic range is alright. The nighttime videos from the telephoto cam are usable, but far from great. They are often crops from the main camera. They have nice colors and contrast, but they're rather soft. Low-light video from the ultra-wide cam is quite solid, with nice exposure and sharpness, and higher than expected resolve detail. The colors, contrast, and dynamic range are all good too. So that's the iPhone 14 Pro. While it may look mostly the same as the previous model, besides the notch, there are quite a few other things to like here too. You've got the brighter screen, the always-on display, and the new chipset. The main cam's higher resolution means you get 2 times lossless zoom now, and autofocus on the selfie cam is great to have. Compared to the 13 Pro, the difference isn't night and day, but the 14 Pro is just a little bit better. That's about what we expected from Apple, and the phone earns our full recommendation. Thanks for watching guys, and see you on the next one.